So we've been talking about various aspects of the Constitution and how it guards against tyranny, and I wanted to give you a little bit more background on some of those topics. So the first one is the Articles of Confederation. So right after the American Revolution, the colonists realized that they needed their own form of government, and so they established the Articles of Confederation. They were afraid that if they made the Articles of Confederation too strong, people wouldn't follow it. And so the Articles of Confederation was extremely weak. The government didn't have any control. States had more power than the national government, and so there was tension in that fact that the national government didn't have power to control what the states were doing. All of this came to a head with Shays' Rebellion. Farmers started rebelling, they started a riot, and the government couldn't even call upon an army to put the rebellion down. They had to just wait it out. And so the framers of the Constitution decided we need to have a constitutional convention. They met in Philadelphia in 1787, and they wrote the Constitution that we still have today. So all of the laws in the whole United States have to be cross-checked against the Constitution to make sure that they are following all of the laws. During the Constitutional Convention, there were some issues that came up between different states and different groups of people for how the Constitution should be written. The first issue is the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise is in reference to how we got our Congress or our legislative branch. So small states like New Jersey wanted one legislative house, because they make the laws, where each state had equal representation. So every state would have 2 representatives. Virginia, the larger state, wanted a plan where there would be 2 house legislative branch, both houses based on representation, or both houses have representation based on population. Population would benefit a large state because there are more people living there. Population would not benefit a small state because less people live there. So what they came up with was this thing called the Great Compromise. And the Great Compromise said that we have 2 houses, a Senate and a Congress. Senate has equal representation, so that's the New Jersey plan, the small states plan, equal representation. And then the House of Representatives matches the large state plan, the Virginia plan, and has representation based on population. So you might be thinking to yourself, great, they have this all figured out, but what they didn't have figured out was how population was to be counted, especially for states in the South, because of the enslaved Africans that lived there. So this is an image that represents the 3/5 compromise. This was a compromise that was reached because Southern farmers, the Southern representatives wanted to count their enslaved Africans as a person so that their populations would be greater, even though the enslaved Africans couldn't vote and didn't have a say in society. The smaller states, or the states that didn't have slaves, felt like this was unfair because then there would be more representation for the states in the South. So what they came up with was this thing called the 3/5 compromise. And that meant that for every 5 slaves, only 3 of those slaves would count. Or each slave counted as 3/5 of a person. And this is in contrast to the white citizens who were all counted individually. They got 1 count per white person. So each slave only counted as 3/5 of a person. So in our government, we have 3 branches. The first branch is the executive branch, and the executive branch of the United States includes the president, vice president, and the president's cabinet. And his responsibility, the executive branch's responsibility, is to enforce laws. So laws get passed, the president puts them into place, and then he's responsible for making sure that that law gets going, gets put into law. So many of you have seen the current president sign bills into law. That is his responsibility. He cannot create the laws, but he has to approve the laws. And so we'll talk about that in a second. So the Electoral College is how our president is voted into the office. So the way it works is that each state holds an election. So in Nevada, we hold an election. We have an election coming up on November 6th. It's not a presidential one. But during the presidential election, the whole state, everybody in the state votes. Now, once the whole state votes, there's a popular vote, which is each individual vote counted, and an electoral vote. So in Nevada, we have 6 electoral votes, and that's based on the number of representatives we have and the number of senators we have. Each state has 2 senators. So Nevada has 4 House of Representatives members and 2 senators, and that gives us our 6 electoral votes. So in the election, if more people who live in the state want the Republican candidate, our 6 electoral votes go to the Republican candidate. If more people in the state want the vote for the Democratic candidate, then our 6 electoral votes go to the Democratic candidate. So you can see California has a lot of electoral votes, Texas has a lot, Florida has a lot, New York, Pennsylvania. And remember, the electoral votes are based on the House of Representatives seats, which are based on our population. A lot of people have problems with the Electoral College, but for now, it's still in place. So checks and balances. So checks and balances refers to our 3 branches of government. You have the executive branch, which is the president. You have our legislative branch, which is Congress, which is split into 2 houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. And you have the Supreme Court. Checks and balances make sure that one of these branches of government does not become too powerful. So the executive branch enforces laws. The legislative branch creates the laws, and the Supreme Court makes sure the laws are constitutional. So law has to go from the legislative branch to the president. The president then has the option to veto the law or cancel it. If the bill is vetoed or the law is vetoed, it goes back to Congress. If the bill is passed, it goes to the Supreme Court to make sure that it is legal, and once it is legal, it can then be put into law. So this system of checks and balances is supposed to make sure that not any of the branches have too much power. Another example, the president gets to nominate Supreme Court justices. So the president nominates somebody. The Senate then votes on that person to say whether or not they are allowed to take that position the president nominated them for. And so the separation of powers. So we have our legislative branch, which is Congress, the Senate, and the House, and they create the laws. The executive branch enforces the laws, and the judicial branch makes sure that all the laws are legal. So after the Constitution was written, there were 2 groups of people, the Federalist and Anti-Federalist. Remember that Federalist is a word that refers to a government that has a state and a central power. So the Federalists, which are Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, they want the Constitution to be passed. So they write a series of papers to encourage the colonists to ratify or approve the Constitution. Now, in opposition to this, we have the Anti-Federalist. Oh, here's another picture of the Federalists. So you have Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay. And then in opposition to this, you have the Anti-Federalists, which are John Henry, George Mason, and John Adams. And they did not want the government to be as strong. They did not want the central government being as strong as it was in the Constitution. So they wrote papers, the Anti-Federalist papers, encouraging the colonists to not ratify the Constitution. Eventually, ratification takes place. The Constitution is signed September 17th. And before the Constitution gets signed, something is added called the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Those are the first changes made to the Constitution where the framers of the Constitution added specific protections for the citizens of the United States. So the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and the Constitution was not ratified until those 10 amendments were added to it.